It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Kinderman, who's the Professor of Clinical Psychology from the University of Liverpool, and he'll be speaking to us on the theme of mental health, politics and social justice.
So thank you for that. Only slightly intimidated by the setting. And I shall try to stick to my notes, but it probably won't happen, and I'll probably go over, so apologies for that. To start off on a political note, I first tried to join the Labour Party. I was unable to join the Labour Party on the grounds of my age before I was 16 years old. And I think, looking back at those times, even then I would have referred to myself as a socialist. But I've now been a clinical psychologist for more than 28 years, which is more than I've not been a clinical psychologist. And so part of what I want to talk about today is why I think that my political views, both with a small and with a capital P, and my professional views when it comes to mental health are intertwined. So I thought I'd start off in the field of mental health, partly because it's where I'm most comfortable. So here, trying to summarize how I think about things, trying to bring my ideas to a conclusion, I've argued that we should see mental health as primarily a social and psychological phenomenon. And this is really turning things around a little bit. So instead of seeing mental health problems as primarily medical illnesses with psychological and social components, I argued that we should see our mental health as primarily a set of psychological and social phenomena that may have some medical aspects to them. And it's turning that idea through 180 degrees. What that means in practice is, at least in my opinion, it has some implications for how we deliver services. So we should move away from the idea of diagnosis being a medical issue, towards a more scientific, a more phenomenological issue. Identify the phenomena, describe them, measure them if you like, try to work out why those circumstances have occurred, and think about what we might do to help people, which is rather different from the idea of diagnosing illnesses and then treating the underlying disorders. And what it means is we need, at least I think as a psychologist, to understand how people have come to look at the world in the way that they do, understand the events that have happened to us, how we've made that sense of those events, and what implication that has for our mental health. And so using what clinical psychologists would refer to as this scientist-practitioner model, the idea of an applied scientist rather than a medical practitioner, we try to offer evidence-based interventions to help people who are struggling either emotionally or in terms of their behaviours and responses to events. But what that means, underpinning all of that, is this idea that our thoughts and our emotions, our behaviours, our mental health in my case, that these phenomena are dependent on how I've made sense of the world. And furthermore, that how I make sense of the world is a product of how I've learned to make sense of the world because of the things that have happened to me. So my understanding of the world, the sense I make of my own emotions, the responses that I have to the challenges, are shaped by the events that have occurred to me, the way that I've learned to respond to those events. And to that extent, biological factors, the differences between us as individuals, the events that happen to us in our lives, parenting, schooling, education, affect our mental health in the sense that they affect the way that we understand the world around us. What that means, I think, is that we can move from a kind of intellectual analysis of the situation to something that's more akin to a manifesto. So we're thinking then about, if that's how our mental health has developed, if that's how we should analyse the factors that impinge on our mental health, what should we do about it? What we know is that, rather surprisingly, mental health outcomes clinically in the United Kingdom are at least not getting better and might be getting worse. In other areas of medicine, if we think about heart disease, cancer care, obstetrics, childbirth, oncology, in all of these areas, clinical outcomes have got better over time. In psychiatry, in mental health, the same has not happened. People's life expectancy has not got better. The chances of recovering a worthwhile life have not got better. the chances of being free from medication and to regard yourself as no longer experiencing the problems that drew you to seek help have not got better over time, despite the fact that more and more people have been diagnosed with having mental health problems and more people are taking medication. About 18% of the adult population is now taking some form of psychiatric drugs, and that rate of prescription has doubled in the last decade. Incidentally, the rate of prescription of antidepressant drugs is has predominantly increased in areas of social deprivation, which I think is a political point. Part of this, I think, is because of the reliance of our healthcare system on what I regard as misguided understandings of the supposedly biomedical nature of mental health problems, to focus the problems on pathologies of the brain and the neural system of the individual, rather than looking at social and psychological factors leading to people having distressing experiences and leading to problems. And because of that, because we focus inappropriately, in my opinion, on issues to do with the biochemistry and the medical aspects of the individual rather than the wider social perspective, it means that people are having increasing reliance on psychiatric medication, and we know that that psychiatric medication is actively harmful for people's health. In my personal opinion, there's very little evidence after the short-term effects of these medications that drugs do people a great deal of good. In the medium and long term, both antidepressant use and antipsychotic use, and certainly anxiolytics, seem to do people more harm than good, although it seems in the short term they may be beneficial for some people. I think it's also the case that our services are fragmented, they're certainly under-resourced, and they don't deliver what people want. So current mental health services fail to invest in alternatives to the current biomedical approach to mental health care. People routinely ask for, demand, are referred for, and certainly need psychological, and more than psychological therapies, social interventions that would prevent their difficulties becoming problems in the first place. I'm not a big fan of people taking increasing doses of medication, but I'm not really a big fan of people being referred to therapists either, although I work as a therapist myself. I think we should turn the taps off before mopping the floor, and I think we should solve some of the social and environmental problems that lead to the difficulties in the first place. And those are services that people are calling out for but are not currently available. So I think instead what we should do is promote the use of accurate, in my opinion, scientifically valid, non-stigmatizing. People are not blamed for their problems, but people are also not seen as weak or ill or disordered. Scientific and evidence-based approaches to mental health. For me, I think that a sensible understanding of our mental health rejects the idea that our more distressing experiences come from pathologies of the brain, and instead look for social and psychological factors that might lead to people being in difficulty. And therefore, I think we need to focus on explanations that stress the way in which we've been shaped by the events around us. In part because that will lead to a greater appreciation, paradoxically maybe, that we can do something to get ourselves out of the situation. If what's happened is that we have been damaged by events and have learned to respond to events by, for instance, blaming ourselves or worrying unnecessarily about the things that happen to us, that's something which is undeniably a consequence of the things that have happened to us, but it's also something that we can reverse, perhaps through friends and perhaps through support from our families, perhaps through community support, perhaps through therapy. But we can reverse the impact of events and circumstances on our lives in a way that gives us, I think, more hope than the idea of treating the brains of people suffering from mental illnesses. Because the most powerful determinants of mental health, at least in my opinion, are the social and psychological factors. I think if we are to protect people's mental health, then we need to think about wider social and even political change. I think we often, as a society, neglect that, in part by effectively blaming individuals who've suffered for their problems. But I think social and political changes are likely to make much more difference overall than anything that therapists can do. So, for instance, the majority, statistically, the majority of people, most people who come seeking help for hearing voices or who have paranoid fears have experienced poverty, And poverty is something that's rightly the cornerstone of government. And although politicians play lip service to this, I think that most of the political decisions that have been made over the past few years have actually increased inequalities. And the impact of that on the mental health of individuals is difficult to overestimate. There's been a research study coming out of the University of Liverpool that suggests that 2 people attempt to take their own lives for every 100 people who are rendered unemployed, mainly men. Now, I think we live in a society where perhaps having a salaried job is more important than it should be, perhaps. There are more important things than working for somebody else's financial benefit. And it's something possibly of a regret that that impact seems to be stronger for men than it is for women. It's something about the gendered nature of our society. But it's also the case that whereas it's very difficult to see or understand the biological factors that make people vulnerable to mental health problems, we know with depressing certainty that if people are rendered unemployed, then the consequence is that people become depressed, feel hopeless, and in large numbers attempt to take their own lives. The Royal College of Psychiatrists recently concluded that 700 people have taken their lives as a direct result, in their opinion, of the 2008 economic crash. It's very difficult to see what biological factors might have led to this. It's very easy to see how social and economic factors. And of course, absolute poverty, unemployment are not the only causes. Richard Wilkinson, in the book The Spirit Level, with Kate Pickett, talks about how inequalities make for unhappy societies where people are judging themselves, comparing themselves, feeling inadequate, pressurized, competitive, and suffering when people lose out in some of the race to maximize your benefit at the expense of other people's. And then finally, of course, or possibly not finally, overt experiences of racism, assault, and in my case, for the work that I do, often abuse in childhood are hugely important. And again, it's not necessarily a party political point or a point between the right and the left, but protecting children from abuse and protecting young people from bullying in schools is immensely important in developing their sense of who they are. We struggle as a nation, and I think we struggle across the world, to come up with ever more implausible hypotheses for the role of neurotransmitters in the development of mental health problems. And yet we could easily imagine an 11-year-old walking to school where she knows that she's going to be treated like shit for the rest of the school day, and then going home and not wanting to talk to her parents about how she feels. And then we think, yeah, interesting, Peter. But let's focus on the dopamine system. And you think, no, let's focus on making our schools pleasant places for children to grow up. So I think we need to think about protecting children from abuse. We need to think about strengthening schools. We need to think about how teachers and social workers and general practitioners, educational psychologists in my case, and community leaders can work together in order to protect people from those factors that we know will impact on people's health. And my point for being here today is that that's political as well as a clinical issue. So what's running through all of this is this emphasis repeatedly, at least in my mind, on the social determinants of health and well-being. And that's what brings together my work as a clinical psychologist with kind of thinking and feeling as a political agent in society. It's a question really about why people behave in the way that they do. And I think, and this is not necessarily wonderful conversations to have with people that I regard as sort of political bedfellows, but it's about explaining what the roots and the origins are of the differences between people. I think that one of the things that gets a little bit confused in psychology is this idea that we think with our brains and that we believe in a sort of mechanistic determinist sense of human decision-making. And for the avoidance of doubt, my brain is the organ with which I think. Okay, I don't think with anything else. But it doesn't mean to say that explaining things in the sense that we're talking about today, by reducing things to the biological processes of the brain, constitutes what we really mean by cause. It is certainly true that every thought I've ever had, whether it's a grandiose thought or a pleasant and positive optimistic thought, or whether it's a depressive and nihilistic thought, every thought that I've ever had has involved the neurochemistry of my brain. But that doesn't mean that the neurochemistry of my brain has caused those thoughts. I think what we really mean, both in mental health and in politics, when we think about cause, is why are we different? So why am I happy and confident and relaxed, whereas you are anxious and depressed? Or more to the point, why am I happy and confident today, whereas tomorrow I'm anxious and depressed? So when we think about cause, we don't think, can we understand the pathways that lead from here to there? We know the pathways. The pathways are to do with the functioning of the brain and the chemistry of the neural system. When we think about cause in this political sense, we mean what explains the differences between people's trajectory in life. And then I think that the differences between us as a community in terms of our biological differences in the way that our brains function, even bearing in mind that some of us are male and some of us are female, and that difference is a real difference, right? But those differences between us in terms of the biological functioning of the brain, in my professional opinion, pay very little effect on the differences between us in terms of our trajectory when it comes to our mental health. What makes a difference is what we've experienced and how those experiences have shaped our understanding of who we are, how to relate to other people, how to understand the world, and how to think about the future. It's those differences in experience and sense-making, in my opinion, that explain differences between people, and I think it's scientifically illiterate to try to explain those sorts of differences between people in terms of biological differences. So I think that that also relates, in my opinion, to trajectories, not only in terms of mental health, but other trajectories in life, which is coming back to the political issue, is, why was I able to live the life that I have? Why have I made the choices that I have? Why have I had the experiences where I have? And why is it the case that I drive a reasonably newish BMW and other people are struggling financially? And I don't think it's the biology of my brain. I think it's because of the chances that I've had in life, the circumstances in which I grew up, and the way that I've been helped through my upbringing, education, parenting, and schooling to look at the world in a particular way. So again, I need to emphasize the differences between us, in my opinion, in terms of our mental health, have very little to do with biological differences between us and a lot to do with the experiences that we've had and the sense that we've made of them. And politically, I think that applies to an awful lot of things in the world, and that separates me from some other individuals. So this relates to the idea of the way in which the circumstances in which we grow up, the experiences that we have, and the culture impact on us. This is apparently a real photograph of how our glorious leader, the most powerful man in the world and the thought leader of the of democratic future, over some homeless people in the Indian city of Mumbai. And the idea that there are people who don't have a home, don't have anywhere to sleep for the night, growing up literally in the shadow of people saying there is only one way to live, the Trump way. I think you can see that, in my opinion, it's those sorts of setting conditions, not only in terms of the abuse and the physical pain that people are experiencing, but also in terms of the understanding that they have of their world. And if we exacerbate this by telling them that if they become depressed, it's because they've got a disorder or a disease or an illness or some deficiency, I think we're only compounding the problem. Back in 1967, Martin Luther King spoke to the American Psychological Association and issued what he called a call to arms for the nation's behavioral scientists. And back then, what King was talking about was the links between racism and unemployment and living conditions on people's psychological well-being. And I think we can see things very similar today. The idea of austerity, right-wing populism, and probably because of austerity and right-wing populism, Brexit shaping our understanding of the world. So we live in very similar circumstantial issues. I think that there are issues of life and death. As I said, between 2008 and 2010, immediately following the great economic crisis, and that's before we have inflicted major economic damage on the country by going through Brexit. There were around somewhere between 700 and 1,000 more deaths by suicide in England and Wales than you would have predicted on pure historical grounds. And most of those excess deaths can be attributed to rising unemployment. So when we talk about the political context of mental health, I think we have a duty, as Martin Luther King was saying, to speak out about those social and economic and political circumstances that impact on our clients, in my case, and on the general public, and to bring those evidence to politicians. Martin Luther King talked about being maladjusted, was his phrase. So he, talking to psychologists, he deliberately used the term of maladjustment to refer to a moral and political and wise and values-based refusal to accept the circumstances that we're given. And now I think it's pretty clear that unemployment, exploitative employment practice like 0 hours contracts and insecure jobs, the gig economy, are damaging our well-being. And that's regardless of our gender and our level of education, ethnicity, and so forth. We know that the longer people remain unemployed, the worse the effect, and we know that people don't adapt to unemployment. People's well-being is permanently reduced. And in contrast, re-employment, finding decent, productive, meaningful employment, doesn't necessarily mean salary generating, but meaningful employment leads to higher well-being. So Martin Luther King said there are some things in our society, some things in the world to which we should never be adjusted. And I think he's right. I've put up here another Nobel Prize winner who I quite like, a French philosopher, Albert Camus. I quite like Albert Camus because one of the things that he did, as well as writing Nobel Prize-winning novels, was that he had a choice to make during the Nazi occupation of Germany, the Nazi occupation of France. And I won't name him, but other existential philosophers sort of hung around and sort of gently got on with their lives and wrote novels and so forth. Yeah, and Albert Camus decided to become the editor of Combat, the newspaper of the French Resistance. So you can see on which side of the equation his thing. Now, one of the other reasons why I like Albert Camus is just in a throwaway line that was never published, but he wrote in his diary. He said, "Psychology is action, not thinking about yourself." And I think that's the point. If you recognise that the things that shape us as human beings are the social and political events in the world, the things that happen to us, rather than some sort of innate effort of will, then I think you have to be active. So like I say, what we do as psychologists is we study why people behave as they behave. And for me, that boils down, in one sense, to why are there differences between individuals. And the differences I see come about as a result of the things that happen to us and the way that we make sense of it. Which leads to, so what do we do about this? So there are several things I think that we could do, and I thought a little bit about this because this is explicitly and overtly political event. So in part, psychologists, clinical psychologists like myself, are employed by the National Health Service. So I think one of the things that we can think about is how we exercise our contracts of employment. Do we exercise our contracts of employment through NHS trusts and ultimately the NHS and then the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care? Do we exercise our contracts of employment by focusing on the individual and treating supposed disorders, basically being human versions of antidepressants? I think not, really. I think that a genuinely psychosocial approach to service delivery would mean that we would increase our investment in people who would intervene in order to address people's genuine problems at their root causes. So that would mean a major emphasis on prevention. It would mean tackling issues such as marital separation, not necessarily because staying with an abusive partner is a good thing, but because I think we should offer caring professionals to help you negotiate your trajectory, whichever direction you want to go in. I think we could think about such things as unemployment, about working practices, financial difficulties. So the link between mental health problems and debt, for instance, is a complicated circular relationship, but certainly worthy of intervention. Illnesses in family members, people caught up in crime, people who are perpetrators of crime, people commit crimes for reasons, right? There are reasons why crimes are committed, and there are consequences if you're a victim of crime. We need to think a lot, I think, about assaults, but possibly even more on bullying, peer-on-peer bullying children at school, including on social media, and the abuse of children by adults. I think we need psychological therapists, but I think we need more than that. Anne Cook, who's a colleague of mine, works down in Kent, pointed out that it's no good mopping the floor and leaving the tap running. So we need to shift, I think, our focus, and people like myself who are employed within the National Health Service need to be employed on contracts that permit us to shift our focus a little bit from only intervening at the level of the individual to think about protection and prevention. We should think about supporting families and relationships, preparing people to be mothers, supporting people at work, working with employers to make their workplace a healthy environment. I know that this is being recorded, but I shall say it anyway. I went to I was invited to talk to the BBC, who were great. I like the BBC. I like the BBC a lot. But they were launching a new mental health strategy, and one of the things that came up was the idea of somebody put their hand up in the audience and said, what is the BBC doing about increasing the resilience of its members of staff? And a senior manager, and I was mildly shocked because he knew who I was, which sounds a bit arrogant, but the point is I'd been invited there to talk about these sorts of issues as a psychologist. And he goes, the BBC employs people who are highly creative, thought leaders, creative, energetic, inspiring, creative types. It's really important that people who come and work here are robust enough to withstand that sort of creative environment, which is bollocks. It's probably illegal bollocks, but it's bollocks. The BBC needs to make itself an environment where people who have the full range of both robustness and sensitivity of the rest of the population can come and work safely. More to the point, you're more likely to get creative and energetic people coming to work for you if you don't insist that they're some sort of superhuman, resilient person, because they're probably more likely, A, to be more creative, B, to be more loyal to you, and C, probably not bully their workmates in a vain attempt to try to make my point. So I think we need to, as mental health professionals, as well as, and perhaps even instead of, treating individuals for supposed disorders, we need to work with schools and with workplaces in order to protect people from distress. We need to work with services like citizen advice, debt counselling agencies, victim support. We need to go into schools and work with teachers, not only to counsel distressed children who are seen as having difficulties, but to design schools in such a way that it makes those schools good places to learn. I mean, one of the things which I wasn't intended to say, but it's come up in my mind, so I shall say it anyway. But there's this increase in the number of children who are diagnosed with the diagnosis of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And that worries me. It worries me not only because of the diagnosis and the consequence, but it worries me also about the prescription of Ritalin, a very powerful amphetamine, in order to potentially help those children. Now, it strikes me that children starting school, especially if they start school as early as the age of 4 or 5, if you go to Iceland, they won't start school that young because it's a stupid thing to do and it's part of hot housing and we shouldn't do it. And kids should be kids and kids should just get on with being kids. And if you don't want to learn to read until you're 7, well, fine, then you're missing out. But, it's no great shakes. It's the teachers and the schools that suffer because their stats are poor. My wife is a governor of our local school, and Ofsted inspectors coming and look at the stats of the performance of the kids is a really stressful experience. All wrong. And the kids differ, of course, at the age of 5. So one kid who has a birthday in August and another kid who has a birthday in September will be in the same class, but one of them is 20-25% more cognitively developed in simple maturational terms than the others. And we all come in different shapes and sizes. Now, I said earlier that the differences between us in terms of our biology in impacting on our mental health is probably relatively small. But some kids pay attention easier than others, especially young kids. Young kids have difficulty in paying attention. Kids from disadvantaged backgrounds have difficulty paying attention. Kids whose first language is not the language of the teacher have difficulty in paying attention. And, ultimately, kids differ in all sorts of ways. Kids who are being abused at home have difficulty in paying attention, and kids who are being bullied in class have difficulty in paying attention. Final point is my cortisol levels tend to spike at about 5 o'clock in the morning, which is good because it wakes me up so that I don't get eaten by wolves and attacked by journalists. But for children's cortisol levels spike much later in the day. So what do? Well, we design schools where the kids are supposed to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning, where if there are differences between them in terms of their ability to sustain attention, it's exacerbated by the fact they're starting when their cortisol levels are really, really low. It's just a bad way to do it. We make them work until 3 o'clock, and then the teachers, whose cortisol levels are just about spiking, get the 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock shift where they prepare for the next day. Incidentally, if you're going to prepare for the day, why don't you prepare for the day between 8 and 11 and then start seeing the kids at 11? So I wouldn't design the whole thing in this way at all. I'd design the entire schooling system in a way that's more responsive to the individual needs of the kid. I'd start later in the day. I'd start later in the at a later age. I would have school classes which are streamed to take account of the particular education on the developmental needs of the children. And then if there were difficulties with a child having difficulty paying attention, then and only then would I start to work out what we could do. Oh, and incidentally, when you started to work out what you could do about a kid who was having difficulty sustaining attention in class, I'd start off by assuming that it's something where they could learn if you taught them in a different way to sustain their attention. I wouldn't start off by giving them amphetamines. It just strikes me as a bad idea. Oh, and I was going to say finally, and that isn't finally. The final thing was going to be don't give them amphetamines. Amphetamines are bad stuff. But the final thing is don't label them with a disease, when quite possibly what's happening is that they just don't like the way. A friend of mine is a public health doctor called Alex Scott Samuel, and he had a T-shirt on that said, "I don't have ADHD, you're just boring." Anyway, I wasn't going to talk about ADHD, but I will. And incidentally, if any of you do have children who are struggling at school, that's a real issue, and we should help. And educational psychologists must help you with your children if you're having difficulty paying attention at school. Kids differ in the way that they pay attention, and kids have different educational pathways, and we should help you with that. I don't think they're ill, and I don't think they would necessarily benefit from taking Ritalin. There are other ways to help people. That's my opinion. So, once we start going down that route, I think the way in which not only psychologists, but I think other mental health professionals start to engage with the users of services should shift substantially. I don't actually think that necessarily means we should stop doing things. I think we need to invest in our health service to give ourselves the headspace in order to start doing some of this preventative work, rather than just mopping the floor after leaving the taps running. But I think we need to go back. We need to go back further. We need to think about the abuses of human rights, individual abuses and assaults, bullying, discrimination, unfair treatment. If any of you watched Carrie Gracie from the BBC talking about the way in which, she was paid something like £200,000, £300,000 a year, but she was in tears when talking about the inequity of her treatment compared to her male colleagues. And she was upset. Now, one attitude is, well, she's paid a lot of money, so why would you be upset? But for her, there was a grinding issue of everyday discrimination happening on her watch, and it upset her. So we've got these issues of discrimination and assaults on our human rights and unfairness, bullying, and we need to essentially ensure that our rights and rights to equity are maintained. One of the things that we could do, which would be a step in the right direction, which is really not a solution to these problems. I think my manifesto for change is quite wide-ranging. But one small step that we could take, which is paradoxically within the scope of our current mental health services, is if any of you know the way that the diagnostic system works, we have codes for things like major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, personality disorder, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and we code these things with little numbers that we attach to the diagnoses. And alongside the codes for these diagnoses are codes for psychosocial conditions. So there is a World Health Organization diagnosis for which, incidentally, the World Health Organization, not your employer, unfortunately, but the World Health Organization states this diagnosis is legitimate for reimbursement purposes of homeless. There's unemployment as a code, a diagnostic code. There's childhood abuse, there's problems with your employer, there's marital difficulties, there's a whole range of psychosocial conditions, all of which are diagnosable codes under World Health Organization rules, and we never use them. It is just as legitimate to request permission to intervene to help somebody because they're homeless as to help somebody because they meet the criteria for depression, and we never do it. One wonders why. So we could do that. We know that, for instance, in North London, probably around here, actually, about 93% of occasions there's no mention of any of the psychosocial factors in people's conditions. There's a mention of the diagnoses and the treatment and no mention of the psychosocial factors, despite the fact that we know how prevalent those experiences are. So, there you go. So that's it, really. What do we do? Well, and why do we do it? Well, as I look at things, about the way that I make sense of everything, including things like my behaviour more generally and whether or not I commit crimes, but certainly in the case of mental health, I see people making sense of the things that have happened to them. Because of what's happened to me in my life, I've made sense of the world, and that framework of understanding gives me the platform from which I engage with the world. If I've learned that I'm a worthless and inadequate person who will never achieve anything when I put my effort into factors, then that will influence my mental health and my behaviour. If I learn that on the whole gold drops in my lap no matter what I do, I will enter the world with a very different attitude. So if we're told that we're worthless or stupid or ugly, or if we're told merely that we are pawns to be used by abusers or capitalist oligarchs, then we'll learn from that. And it will have consequences not only for our mental health but for our wider behaviour. So for me then, this idea of a perspective on mental health is a social determinist approach. And that brings me right back to my political views. And it's at this point in the talk that I realise possibly that when I was 16 and was applying to join the Labour Party, I had my sights set on becoming a politician, and I changed my mind and became a psychologist. And I'm now thinking that maybe I made a terrible mistake. And possibly there's just about time to reverse my decision and take a different path in life. And at that point, I shall stop.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got, I think, about 25 minutes, and we are going to keep the questions and short and sweet, and the answers hopefully in response to that. Yep.
Thank you. I trained I did a social science degree in the 70s, and I kind of remember being taught pretty much what you said. And Bernard Lang was my hero. And I want to know what you think the factors are that have prevented this perception and this response that actually is the right one, and what you say is absolutely right. What's prevented that in all those years? What's stopped it being accepted?
Okay, so I'll just bathe for a few seconds in you saying what you said was absolutely right. So I should just let that out. I think it's convenient for everybody. So recently. I mean, I've taken various leadership roles within British psychology and clinical psychology, and we've got quite a lot of abuse from people. If you look on Twitter, there's quite a lot of nastiness with people being quite abusive about some of the things that we write. I think it's convenient for everybody. It's convenient for politicians to say that the way to deal with abused kids is to treat them for the post-traumatic stress disorder that they're suffering. And in fact, they can even campaign for better services for it. So everybody can be on the right side of the equation. But it's convenient because they don't actually have to think about how we prevent abuse happening in the first place. We can take kids who've been traumatized because they've been bullied through social media, and of course they were bullied before. And instead of going, how are we going to radically change our educational system in order to protect our children? And actually, do we need to change the way that people in the UK think about childhood? You know, do we need to do something about our society in order to make us more engaging and positive towards our young people? Because there is these things that we put up on the walls, these mosquitoes that send out the high-pitched squeaking to keep the kids away from us because we just don't like children very much. It's not convenient to go down that route. It's much more convenient to treat people for the illnesses. It's convenient for the pharmaceutical companies because they make £1,000 million a year out of giving us drugs that, in my opinion, probably do more harm than good. I think that it's convenient for people like Atos and Esther McVeigh and the benefits people to say being depressed is either a mental health problem, in which case you'll get minimal benefits and we'll write you off as a human being, or you can go back to work. I think it's convenient for employers to say you're either resilient enough to work here or we've got grounds to sack you. And I think it's convenient for my mental health colleagues to take very large salaries in order to treat people for non-existent illnesses. I think it's convenient for everybody, apart from it's turning the country to shit.
Ask a question.
You're not being filmed. Okay. I really don't know because I'm not it's really coincidental that you were speaking about the green economy and the health, because earlier today we were the mayor's London Assembly on the work committee, and I just wanted to ask you something that wasn't covered is, do you think that employers have a role to play in the mental health of the employees who have mental health problems, and
political affiliations that actually have an influence how they approach their employees.
Interesting. So I've been asked to repeat the question. So the question is about the role of employers in maintaining and protecting the mental health of their employees who do and who don't have mental health problems, and also whether their political affiliations might have something to do with it. So first thing is, yes, of course. I mean, part of it is, one of the things that I'm proud of a few things when I was head of department at Liverpool. One of the things I was proud of is that I changed the nature of the management structure of the unit that I was responsible for against opposition, I have to say, from the union, but also from senior management who told me I wasn't allowed to do it, and I put workers' representatives on the board because I think that's the way that it should go. In my opinion, we should move towards any employer with more than X number of employees should, by law, have their board constituted to have workers' representatives on it. That's the way to solve these things. Incidentally, sorry about this, I'm a member of the Labour Party. I'm not a big fan of the trade union system. I think they did a wonderful job getting us to where they are now. I think we should write these things into legislation and legislate to have workers' representatives on boards. And then the workers would be part of the management, which would be a solution to it. Do they have a responsibility for mental health? Of course they do. We all have a responsibility for mental health. Do they have a responsibility to maintain good working environments? Absolutely. This is part of this idea of resilience. If you have a high level of absenteeism due to mental health problems, I think it's indicative of a stressful and poor working environment. Do they have a responsibility for people who don't meet the medicalised diagnostic terms? Of course they do. I mean, if you just don't enjoy being alive and you don't enjoy being a worker, I don't see why you should be diagnosed with an illness in order to have that recognised. I think we should. So I think, yes, across the piece. So absolutely, I think we should move away from the idea of people being resilient or not. I think we should move away from the idea of people either being well or having mental illness. And I think we should think about how employment should be positive and productive and collegiate. I don't particularly agree with the idea of owning companies, for instance. That's a notion that I don't particularly agree with. But do I think it depends on the political allegiance of the employers? Possibly. I mean, part of what I think is that, my big thing really is that I think intellectually, academically, my thing has been about the way that we understand emotions and behaviours. And I think that the metaphor of illness, as in you're either well or there's something wrong with you, as a metaphor for phenomena like depression or anxiety or suicidal thought, I think it's a bad analogy. Just as an example, we diagnose mental illnesses. So we spot a pattern of behaviour in people and we identify it as being symptomatic of an illness. When I take my grandson now, because I'm very old, when I take my grandson for a walk, I point out a heron and I point out a pigeon and I point out a robin, and I'm not diagnosing birds, I'm identifying them. I'm just spotting them. So I think we can spot when somebody is depressed without diagnosing them as being ill. They're different phenomena, right? They're different things. So I don't think people are ill. I think people have problems. Do I think that relates to political affiliation? Probably. So I think the idea that either you're a shirker or you're a striver, that you're either able to work for me or you should be cast out, yeah, I think that fits with a particular political attitude, yes. I wouldn't say that it matches on perfectly to the political left and the political right. I think there are excellent employers who see their employees as partners in the exercise and would therefore feel as badly about somebody who's suffering as a result of their workplace environment as if it was a member of their family. And then there are people who see workers as units of productivity that can be exploited. Do I think that the exploitative, abusive employers tend to vote Tory? Where if you forced me up against the wall and put a gun to my head, I'd say undoubtedly.
Okay. Yep.
My name's Sam, and I have my own experience of depression, and I do a lot of work on mental health. I was just wondering, so do you think that you shouldn't be diagnosing mental illness at all?
Yeah, I think we should identify when people are depressed. I think we should clearly recognise that depression is a phenomenon that exists, is real in that sense, comes about for understandable reasons and affects people's lives dreadfully. And I think we have a moral obligation to spot when that's happening, both in the people around us and in people that we have that sort of legal responsibility for. I think we should recognise that depression is real and serious and a consequence of the things that happen to people in people's lives. I don't think I would regard it as an illness that should be diagnosed. I think it's part of the human condition that should be identified and responded to. So if people say to me that they have themselves experienced depression, then absolutely that's true. If people say they've experienced depression and they wouldn't be alive now if they didn't receive help, of course that's true. And we should absolutely identify depression and respond to it. But I think that that's a long way from saying that we're diagnosing illnesses and then treating people for a disorder. So if you yourself are saying that you've experienced times in your life when you have needed professional help for the sort of reasons that we've been talking about today, absolutely, yes. And I think that's very real, and nobody would suggest that that help is taken from you. Do I think that you've had a sickness or a disease or an illness or a disorder? No. Do I think that diagnosing that experience in the same way as we would diagnose a physical ailment, a pathology of the body, is the best metaphor to reach out and offer to you help? No, I don't. Partly because I think it locates the blame in you. And if you have been depressed, I would like to know why you've been depressed, and I don't think it's because of a flaw or a fault or a pathology in you. I think that there have been things that have happened to us in our lives. Sometimes it's difficult to work out what they are, but I think that identifying the things that have happened to us that have rendered us depressed is a perfectly legitimate exercise. Diagnosing somebody with an illness that requires treating takes us away from understanding their experiences.
Yes, my name's Linda. You talked quite a bit about bullying, but you talked about bullying on an individual level. I wondered if you've got anything to say about what I sort of termed as government gaslighting, which is treating a whole group of people, so people making claims through organisations like PWP, very poorly, and what effect that has on their mental health.
Yeah, well, I think I think you're completely right to spot the sort of psychological weakness in my thesis.
I wouldn't see it as a weakness, but I just wanted you to say something about.
No, it is, because my education has tended to focus on individual experiences rather than group experiences. I'm more of an individualistic psychologist than a social psychologist, so that's... So my answer is partly through the lens of, unfortunately, what an individual will think when they've been exposed to these sorts of messages. So I worry about what we are exposing people to when we talk about wealth creators. So you've got people who describe themselves as wealth creators who employ 1,000 people in their organisation. And of course it's the workers who've created the wealth. But that message isn't come across. I worry about the sort of, I know he was a fictional character, but the greed is good mentality, trickle-down economics, which never works, of course. The idea that material success in the way that capitalism works is somehow a measure of success as a human being. I worry about all of those messages. I worry about the messages given to people when it comes to PIP and the ATOS assessments. And partly, I have to say, for a slightly selfish reason, which is a lot of my colleagues who worry about the messages that I give in mental health say, but don't you realise that, if I can't identify, if people cannot diagnose me as being depressed, I will lose my benefits? To which the answer is, that's the sort of uncaring society in which we live in. So instead of saying, are you able to use buses on your own? No. Well, admittedly, a very, very small number of people are fraudulent, but if you find it difficult to travel on public transport on your own because you find it very anxiety-provoking, that strikes me as a state of affairs to which we should respond. I don't think you have to meet the criteria for an illness, because that's a form of bullying, because it says either you're well, in which case you're exposed to those pressures of work, and you better bloody perform, otherwise there's no gravy for your chips tonight, or you're ill, in which case you're ill. And I don't like that as a message. So I think all of these messages are inappropriate. And of course, when it comes to kids, the resilience idea, the idea that kids are exposed to an environment where they're either successful or there's something wrong with them, it strikes me as very worrying. My voice is breaking because I was remembering a case where I bumped it, when my daughter was about 14. I wandered into the living room and there was a bunch of people having a sort of sleepover party. And her friend Sam was standing out on the patio. So I asked why Sam was standing out on the patio. And what had happened was that we lived near a canal, and some people had mugged him and pushed him into the canal. And this was several weeks earlier. And what had happened was that he got back into schooling, but he found being in social situations quite stressful. So he sort of went outside occasionally. So you got a bunch of kids who responded to Sam by knowing that he sort of came in and came out of the room occasionally, because that's the way that he was dealing with things at the moment. And you think, what lovely kids. But the idea that Sam should be told that there's something wrong with him and that he should either meet the requirements for working in the adult world or accept an illness and accept the treatment, that's the wrong way to respond to Sam. The right way to respond to Sam is if somebody mugs you and pushes you in the canal, you're going to have a time to recover and we'll support you while you're recovering. So yeah, I worry about all of those messages, yes.
It's a very big subject, but I'm just very concerned about our government's policy to prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the people in prisons have actually got, I'm now reluctant having listened to you say mental health.
Yeah, well, yeah. So my psychiatrist colleagues who work in prisons, I think, struggle hard because I think the services are overstretched. And there's a real fundamental problem, which is that, you know, either you move the prisoners out of the prison system or you treat them in the prison system, and inevitably it's the case that they end up receiving psychiatric care while still in the prison system, and that's a problem. And I'm not suggesting that our mental health colleagues working in prisons are doing a bad job. I think they're struggling hard. But I don't see a distinction between one set of explanations for why I do what I do and another set of explanations in either mental health or criminality. So if you've got a kid who thinks, I may as well smoke a bit of weed and then I want to impress my mates and I can't see any future for myself. And anyway, if I get my rocks off by nicking a car, I don't really give a shit because that's it. And if I'm in a punch-up, well, you know, at least I'll get some kudos. I think that's a psychological issue as much as mental health and as much as education. So I would see these things as a psychological phenomenon. And the idea of being experiencing psychosis, hearing voices, and the consequential impact on maybe your drug use, your need to medicate yourself, your ability to hold down a job, your sense of moral responsibility to the society outside, it just strikes me as much more complicated, unfortunately, than there are bad people who need to be sent to prison, there are mad people who need to be in hospital, and there's the rest of us. Unfortunately, my message is a bit more confusing than that. Some of my psychiatrist colleagues point out that a lot of the people in prison are in fact mad and should be in hospital. But since I don't kind of believe in the concept of madness, and I kind of don't believe in the concept of hospital, or at least not in that sense, I think So we should take some lessons from Norway, where you catch somebody who's committed a crime and you try to work out why they've committed a crime and what you can do to prevent that happening again in the future. And that seems a much more sensible way than dividing people into the mad, the bad, and the wage slaves, which is kind of what... Well, no, we have mad, bad, wage slaves and oligarchs, and that's about all we have in Britain. And I'd like something a bit different, I think.
I wonder what your thoughts are on universal basic income.
Ah, yes.
To allow adults sort of freedom from
Absolutely.
and the ability to pursue things that would make them happy and avoid
Yep.
stresses, whether that be in or outside of work.
Huge fan of universal basic income. I know that there are some problems with it. I don't think the problem with it is actually affording it, because if I got paid an extra £10,000 on top of my wage, I'd pay most of it out in tax, and actually because I would, and anyway you can fiddle with the tax system to do it. So a sort of negative income tax, which Lib Dems suggested a while ago and was Green Party policy for a while, is a version of universal basic income. One of the problems I have with universal basic income is that our needs are slightly different. So my brother has very serious mental health problems, and I think that he therefore has some needs related to his disabilities that require a bit of an enhanced payment, and these things come and they go, and so you might be disabled for a while and you might be able to recover functioning. So I think there's an argument for tailoring the universal basic income to take account of need. So you might get an enhanced level of basic income because you have additional needs, and you don't have enough in basic income to pay for 24-hour care if you're severely disabled, for instance. So I think there's some quirks to it, but I love it as an idea, because it strikes me that if you paid me £10,000 a year as a basic income, I would want to work because my quality of life financially is a lot higher than that, and I'd quite like to work. For my brother, you paid him £10,000 a year assuming that it would more or less match the benefits at the moment, he'd carry on with his life. But also if he thought, well, you know what, I could work at the local coffee shop one day a week, and maybe that would ease me back into the world of work, then he could. And if he didn't find it sustainable, he drops back to the basic income. If he did find it sustainable, he'd have a little bit more money to play with, and that would be great. It would allow us to explore. You also get the idea that people who are really entrepreneurial, absolutely. So if I wanted to start up a film production company, if I had a universal basic income, then I could jack my job in and start doing that. Why? Because I'm safe. So I'm safe in order to do the exploratory things, to be an entrepreneur, to have blue skies thinking, and I'm safe if things go terribly wrong in my life. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it, and I think it would take off a lot of the pressure of people working and working and working, and if it all goes horribly wrong, then first of all I'll be on benefits, and secondly the bloody ATOS will come round and when did you catch Down syndrome questions? So I think we can move to a more enlightened. The other problem with basic income is what do you do about people who are migrants, because I'm just not that comfortable with the idea of a policy that only applies to people who carry a British passport. But we need to move, obviously, to the sort of world that people envisaged when they wrote Star Trek, and where everybody's on the. But yes, I think that would alleviate an awful lot of the pressure. It means that people wouldn't be judged in terms of their benefits, entitlement, and people would be freer to take the choices in life that would give them a meaningful sense of the future without being expected to do it. So yeah, big fan.
Okay, final question, because then we'll have had our hour. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
Can you put a question in there, because we're right to the end?
Okay. So the question is, what would the immediate implications for funding and commissioning of services, given that we're in a post-austerity reality, and to shift to prevention or to shift NHS resources to the education system would mean that money was being taken out of the NHS, for instance. Yes, which I feel acutely. I'm slightly ruthless about it, which is, if it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. However, I would recognise that now is not probably the best time to start it. In fact, I think Tony Blair sort of did some okay things with the massive, in fact, expansion of psychological therapies back when there was some money to be put into mental health services. So I guess part of the answer would be, you're right, now's not a good time to be thinking about shifting money away from any current services. I would rather think in terms of, as money becomes available, what should we differentially invest in? And I think that we should maintain our focus on investing in services that help people who up until now have used mental health services, but we should shift it substantially towards a social model. So we should think about unitary authorities having combined health and social care budgets in the same way that Andy Burnham is developing in Manchester. We should think about things like crisis houses rather than hospital beds. So keeping the same number of residential day units for provision, but think about residential houses, crisis houses rather than hospitals. Think about people employing an other staff member to work in schools looking after the well-being of children rather than an other nurse to work in adult mental health services. And when you get the chance to make a choice between where you invest the next £100 million of services, we would make the cold-hearted choice to invest it in children, in the community, in prevention and in social provision, and we wouldn't make the choice to invest that £100 million in another shiny hospital that treats people who are ill. I wouldn't put a great deal of money into fMRI scanners for people with mental health problems. I wouldn't put a great deal of money into the development of new drugs. I'd put a lot of money into making schools nicer places, because ultimately that's going to pay in the long run.
Thank you very much. Thank you.